This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, in-depth conversations with experts from the worlds of arts, sciences and mataranga Māori, brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. Kia ora, I'm Dr Barb.
And I'm Trudi.
And today we are in discussion with Professor Phil Seddon about synthetic biodiversity conservation. And I'm quoting here from a paper that Phil is at least a co-author on. The paper is It Time for Synthetic Biodiversity Conservation? Piaggio et al. 2017 in Trees. So it's a reasonably out there paper. It's had some time to mellow, as we say. So synthetic biology. Synthetic biology is a rapidly expanding field where engineering principles are applied to the construction of biological parts and systems, resulting in new and desired traits they would not have in their original or natural state. And of course, it's possible through the amazing new technologies that we have now that we didn't used to have, and those just keep increasing. And a lot of people commonly think of it as de-extinction of species. But we have Professor Phil here in the studio. And Phil, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Barbara.
Thank you very much for coming along. And we thought we'd. What do you think about that for a definition? Is it still right? Is it still valid?
There are a lot of definitions for synthetic biology as any kind of emerging field, and I think we think about de-extinction as being one little tiny subset of what might sit underneath it. And to me, it's the intersection of biology, technology, and engineering.
Right.
So It comes on the back of our hugely advanced ability to manipulate genetic material, read it, write it, synthesize it.
It's amazing, really.
Extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. You know, when synthetic biology first started, I mean, when you're talking about technology, you're talking, when we first started, not you and I, when people first started decoding DNA, and that was, years to get one genome, and now it's just got faster and faster and faster.
Yeah, and it's more than just reading, it's actually synthesizing it.
Yeah.
And, on the back of things like the CRISPR or these new kind of gene editing techniques.
Which is huge, really. The kind of change is a step change when CRISPR came in, and that ability to sort of clip bits of DNA out of one thing and put them in the other. And there's a whole lot of misinterpretations and kind of misinformation and understandings about how that goes. So I thought maybe we can at some stage later on in this podcast just clarify some of those terms.
Sure. Yeah, well, as much as possible. I'm a conservation biologist, so dip my toes into genetics, but I'm not a geneticist.
And that's interesting because we're coming at this from so the episode today is synthetic biodiversity conservation.
Yeah.
So it's not into those nitty-bitty bits of how the genes work. It's just acknowledging that there are all these techniques out there. How can we use them for biodiversity conservation?
Exactly, yeah.
And, I might just take you through a little bit of your background first before we get into it,
Yeah,
Just roll right ahead. I feel like I've fallen into Frankenstein novels, something, like de-extinction and
I know. And I get ahead of myself all there because I start. Anyway, roll right back. BSc Honours at Otago University.
That's right.
Here at Zoology Department?
It was in zoology, yes, back in the day. And I liked it so much I stayed on and did a PhD on hoiho, yellow-eyed penguins.
Oh, nice.
Oh, cool.
Straight into the hoiho. Obviously, fantastic. Bird of the Year this year.
Yeah, in dire straits on the mainland, but hanging on the subantarctic, so we have hope.
Hopefully hanging on here in the mainland as well.
Fingers crossed.
A lot of work going into it.
A lot of work at sort of trying to prop things up, but there are some drivers that we haven't really got the handle of.
Yeah. And then, unusually, did another Master of Sciences. So sort of BSc, PhD, and then back to a Masters of Science at Aberystwyth.
It felt like a strange sequence. After the PhD at Otago, I went and did work at the University of Cape Town.
Right.
On African penguins, so another penguin species.
Oh, right, so still on penguins. Right. Nice.
And, after 3 years of that, wondering about, employment, jobs, things like that.
Yeah, as you do.
And I had been involved while at the University of Cape Town in a small project on desert ostriches.
Right.
Not centrally at all.
I think
all
ostriches desert ostriches.
These were kind of deep desert in Namibia. Yeah.
Oh.
And it was looking at energetics. So the biggest bird in a really dry environment.
Wow.
When I say involved, I was there to kind of help cook and things like that. It was very peripheral.
They're really important support bits.
Oh, well,
it still
I
sounds
thought so,
fascinating,
yeah.
doesn't it?
Well, there was a job. I was applying for everything. And the
Yeah.
job came up from the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia. And I thought penguins to deserts. So I tweaked my CV,
Yeah.
to really pump up this desert ostrich experience. and lo and behold, they actually offered me a job.
Oh, and what was that job?
It was working in out of a captive breeding and research centre that was out in the desert, working in big network of protected areas, doing reintroductions of things like Arabian oryx.
Ah, nice.
So big field programs.
And away
yeah.
from birds.
Well, we were actually employed to look at a bird, a hubara bustard, which there's an Australian bustard. It's a big, mostly walks on the ground, flies really strongly, can migrate. The thing in Saudi Arabia was it's the main quarry for Arab falconers.
Ah.
They depressed their populations. They wanted to build them back up again. So there were big protected areas that were safe from hunting. We were doing a captive breeding program, releasing birds back into those areas.
Oh, right, interesting. So still on birds then.
Peripherally. Well, as soon as you get there, you kind of go, well, there's foxes and different
all
things,
the
raptors
things.
and
And then the
all sorts of stuff.
MSc, how did that come about?
Well, I was there as a biologist working in protected areas, working with the then National Commission for Wildlife Conservation Development, which was the government department. And they were saying, oh, you should write a protected area plan.
Right.
I go, well, I can do that. Well, actually, I can't do that. I did it as a biologist, and I was writing these things thinking, I'm sure I'm not doing a good job of this. I've got a very biological lens on things.
Right.
So in distance learning, I ruined my weekends for the 3 years by doing this online course in protected landscape management through University of Wales.
Oh, right. Oh, that's
Which
interesting.
allowed me to apply the things that I was doing as kind of case studies, and then wrote a thesis at the end that was looking at how might you develop nature-based tourism in Saudi Arabia in these protected areas.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it was a bit backwards, but
that's and it's good. It's quite a skill to be able to recognise when there's something that you don't know. And instead of just bluffing your way through it, which obviously there's times, like as you say, when we're applying for the original job in Saudi Arabia, where it's totally appropriate to just bluff your way through it. But then there's
just
times,
audience, we do ref checks now. Don't try bluffing your way anymore.
But I mean, there's also times
here's
when
my transcript.
Yeah, when it's good to actually, when it's the time is to actually recognise I don't know enough about this to be doing the thing, and then just go and find out the thing that you know.
The danger is kind of scientists, I think, is that we never feel we know enough about anything.
Yes.
Someone wants to tie you down and say, what's the, is it A or B? And you kind of go, well, it depends on all the other variables.
And
so
you
it can be infuriating like that.
Yes, and you can get the world expert on something and ask them what seems like on the face of it a very simple question, and they'll go, I'm not really sure about that. Yes, no.
Yeah, give me funding and I'll get you an answer.
Ask me in 3 years and then I'll go, well, it's complicated.
Well, a lot of it's not even about funding. It's about things are complicated and it depends.
Yeah.
And the answer is normally it depends.
It's the usual thing. The more you know about something, the more you realise you don't know about something.
Yes. Which brings us to how do you say that? The Dunning-Kruger effect.
Kruger
effect, yes.
Yeah. There's been pushback on that, but I think it could be a thing.
Oh, no, I think it's definitely a thing.
Yeah, you think it's a thing?
Yeah, if you don't know anything, you think it's easy. You get it all the time. Take any young male master's, undergraduate, PhD student, they will immediately come up with
I'm not going to be triggered by any of that.
How you should do this. And it's like, you just haven't thought it through long enough. Like, I've been working on this for 20 years. Yeah. I'm sure if it was just exactly that simple, then it's probably gone through. But it's that thing,
It is infuriating,
There is a lot of, on the surface of things
I don't mind
easy.
it as long as people are open to learning new things. As opposed to having conversations where you're butting heads with someone because they've got a preconceived notion about how the world works and they've got that confirmation bias.
And there's a certain amount of, romance maybe about the naivety of youth and...
Oh yeah,
and and if we did, and if we didn't have people who thought, who didn't think of all the consequences and all the obstacles and why things can't be done would never move anywhere, right? You need to have some people who think.
Well, their brains aren't fully formed, so until you're 25 or something, there's kind of you haven't kind of put together consequences very well, I think.
Yeah, that's possible. Right. Trudi, ask a sensible question.
I don't know if I can.
Our brains are all formed here, so we should be good.
I'm kind of stuck in
We can look at the
25-year-old
consequences.
men. Okay. Explains a lot. Right, so synthetic biodiversity conservation, it's not just de-extinction.
It's not. No, it's much more than that.
So what else does it include?
Yeah.
You think of some intractable conservation challenges, and it could be to do with wildlife disease. It could be to do with low genetic diversity. It could be to do with things not able to adapt to climate change. It could be to do with pest species. Let's take a pest species example. So we're good in New Zealand at getting rats and things off islands.
Mice are always the sticking point.
That's exactly it. We're not really good at mice. We can't control mice.
They're
so
small.
What if you had...
Can you see how flexible those damn things are?
Oh, yeah, the tiny things they go through.
The holes that they get through is absolutely amazing, and how flat they can make themselves.
And mice on islands have a big impact. They get this kind of giantism. These terrible images come off islands like Mariam and Gough Island of these overgrown mice literally eating seabirds alive.
Yeah, which is just something you wouldn't even imagine.
It's awful, yeah.
And it is the one thing that all our eco-sanctuaries really struggle with is mice.
Right.
In the absence of other predators, then the mice also...
Yeah. And it's a whole integrated pest management. You can't just take one thing out.
No.
So what's the solution, or what's a possible solution to mice on islands? You can genetically modify a mouse.
Right. Because, of course, mice are one of the classic lab things.
Yeah.
So the genome of mice is really well known. Right. So there's humans, there's the little fruit fly, there's the little plant Arabidopsis, and there's mice.
You're right.
And that's kind of, and then there's the second tier,
So you can manipulate something called an SRY gene. The SRY gene is common across mammals. It determines sex.
Right.
So it's linked to the sex chromosomes. Now, if you took it off the sex chromosomes and you had that male determining sequence and put it on something that gets inherited right across, it doesn't get sorted out into male or female, you can breed your population out of existence, because if you have a genetically modified male mouse breeds with a normal female, they will only produce males.
Right.
If you've only got males, eventually you don't have any other breeding. Yeah.
Why doesn't natural selection just any individual in that population that somehow mutates so that doesn't work, that SRY in the autosomal, and then you get someone who's just breeding just females and they just run riot because basically there's no females?
That's right. So nature will kind of push back on it, and that's an area of research. What you can do to improve your chances is link this to a gene drive, and you mentioned gene drives earlier.
Yeah,
if you think about normal inheritance, if you've got one trait and it gets inherited by a quarter of the offspring and then a quarter of the offspring, it'll eventually disappear.
Right.
If you can link that trait to something that always gets inherited, or 90% of offspring will have that trait, you will gradually swamp that population with that particular trait.
How?
And there are gene drive complexes.
I don't understand that. So you've got the gene drive trait. So what sort of trait?
No, gene drive is a separate thing.
So what sort of traits would you be using in setting up a gene drive?
Don't ask me about the details of gene drive.
Okay, sorry.
But what you're doing is you're linking the trait that you want to be inherited on a system that means that always gets linked through.
So you've got something that's got strong selection for it, and you're linking your sex one on the autosome to that thing that's strongly selected for.
So instead of 50% and then 50% and 50%, it's like 90% and then 90% and 90%.
I still don't quite buy it in terms of natural selection, because what trait would there be that's so strongly selected for? I'm sounding very controversial.
Yeah, it doesn't work like that, and I wouldn't want to get into explaining about gene drives, but it's a big area of research.
Even if it works for a little bit.
But it's one that kind of disturbs people a bit, because it means you release a trait and it's out there, and it runs. It's like you say, this normal pattern of selection won't dilute it.
Right.
It's off and running. It's like a forest fire.
And I guess you would run the risk there of it getting into the wild population and driving all mice in the world extinct.
Exactly.
And that might be seen, I don't know. There's pros and cons on the mice level, but I guess what the counterpoint is that these are islands.
Exactly.
And it's actually, we know how to keep things out of islands. It's much easier to keep things in islands, right?
Perfect experimental. We've got lots of islands, lots of mice, and as a friend of mine in Doc once said, you could run the experiment. It didn't work out. We know how to get rid of mice.
Yeah.
I think he said we could Brody the hell out of them, as in brodificum. You just mice, scorched earth, start again with another experimental plot.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're a long way away from getting to that point of releasing gene drive.
Because, it does seem like
mice,
where there's a really big problem with them. It's a really difficult conservation problem.
Okay, I've got another one, though.
Okay. But I like the mice one.
Okay, well, no, this is a good one, too. This gets back to birds. So if you think about New Zealand's lost a lot of bird life. We're an island. We're vulnerable to these things. A lot of endemic species. Hawaii is even worse.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine somewhere worse, but Hawaii
is worse. And one of the big drivers of that is avian malaria.
Right.
Since about World War II, when they brought in the Anopheles mosquito, came in on various
did they
things.
Bring in the mosquito?
It wasn't intentional. It just came in with stuff that was being moved around all over the place. And climate change is making it worse because the mosquitoes have a kind of an altitudinal distribution. It gets too cold, they don't go there. But they're creeping up these mountains, and these endemic birds are creeping up the mountains and they're slowly falling off the top.
Right, so there's just
nowhere else to go.
Nowhere for them to go. And that's a risk of New Zealand as well because at the moment we don't have those malaria mosquitoes. Wow, yes. And
yellow-eyed penguins get avian malaria.
Yeah.
It's out there on the peninsula.
And as it warms up, and everything that comes into, not everything, a large majority of things that come into New Zealand tend to come in through Auckland, which is also a big warm wet, easy place for things to go in and spread from, so they can build up a population.
So
there
are proposed.
Trudy's shaking her head at me.
No, that's right. I've just gone.
Proposed synthetic biology solutions to that have actually been applied to addressing things like dengue fever and dealing with mosquitoes in other areas. But for avian malaria, it's called a RIDL, RIDL, release of insects carrying dominant lethals.
Right.
So it's just Dan Tompkins' work on the Trojan.
Yep, that's right. Dan
something.
Tompkins and Neil Gemmell have written a paper on that. Yep.
Yeah.
That exact idea. And there are a couple of different pathways where you effectively they both go so that you produce larvae that die.
Right.
So they never get to that blood-sucking stage. So breeding takes place and then they're just not, again, breeding that out of existence. You have to link it to a gene drive to make that work as well. Same idea. Otherwise natural selection will sort it out.
Pushes it back. And I guess, some places, like with the mice on the islands, the island is small enough, the population is small enough that everything's gone extinct before natural selection has a chance to push back. Yeah, because the population, in terms of the worldwide population of mice, is actually relatively small and relatively contained. So it could actually be that that if the population and space that you're doing it just doesn't have enough time, because you have to go through a reasonable number of generations to get those mutations, to get natural selection to kick back, even without having that gene drive alongside it.
I've got a plant example too.
Oh, have you? I love plants. We always tie everything back to...
easy to get your head around too.
Yeah, go on.
American chestnuts.
Right.
American chestnut. Huge tree. It was dominant on that in the US on that kind of eastern coast. They used to talk about, a squirrel could travel the length of the country without ever touching the ground, just going from one tree to the other.
Right.
It was the dominant canopy.
Yeah.
And a blight came in. A chestnut blight came in on a exotic plants that were brought in.
Right.
And trees started dying. And that entire ecosystem collapsed. And now you apart from one or two chestnuts here and there, they only exist as these kind of small leafy juvenile shrubs who get to a certain size and then the blight kills them.
Right.
Mm.
So what people are trying to do is engineer resistance. And they're looking at, there's an Asiatic chestnut that has natural resistance to the fungus and a few other things. So they're trying to modify the genome of American chestnuts to include this resistance. That's one pathway. Another one is where they take another approach would be to allow genetically engineer the tree to produce an enzyme to break down the poison that the fungus produces that actually kills the tree. So there's a couple of different pathways to get it there. Bottom line, you're genetically engineering an American chestnut to be disease resistant. You could argue it's now a hybrid chestnut because you've put in some Asiatic chestnut genes in there. And they've done that.
And you could actually do that without, a little bit, you could do that without technology as, synthetic technology. You could do it with standard plant breeding. People have done crosses and hybrids.
I guess
it just takes a lot longer,
right?
right?
What you're trying to do, though, is find the exact trait.
Yeah. And that's
this is the genetic sequence in charge.
But it does really link back, and you can see, once you start talking about breeding in disease resistance in a plant, it's really easy to think, okay, well, that's, we've been gardening for
really good way of thinking
for thousands of years, and actually just in a less specific way, that's what we've done. We've bred corn cobs to be big and full of sugar. We've bred potatoes to be big and full of starch.
We've bred them to be edible. If you look at the original corn cob, it was like a dry little grass seed.
Yeah,
extraordinary.
Wheat even. We've bred that to have. There's a lot. There's just when you start looking at plants,
and it takes thousands of years. It takes thousands and thousands of
and
times.
It's an
hit or miss, and
engineering.
you get a bit of this and you get a bit of that and you get these other traits.
Yeah.
What we've got now is the ability to very precisely edit the genome of organisms to express just the traits that we're interested in.
And I guess
so it's the gene engineering that's
the engineering,
now. And then if we did reproduce these trees or get rid of that, do we still have the ecosystem to support them? Or
that's the big question, because at the moment it's just been big trials, and they've been pushing for the last few years to get approval to do releases.
But I guess, with some things it's easy to sort of think, the chestnuts, it's not a long time since that blight came through.
Yeah.
It's, within living memory.
Sure.
So, most of the other things that were there are hanging on in places. They can come in. And that's kind of...
nature doesn't really leave gaps, though.
It doesn't.
It's like other trees and other things will have come in and changed that ecosystem. So it's a big question whether you could ever restore it to a kind of a pre-fungus state, if you like.
You do sort of think though that the things that were also in the community with the chestnut, because they're not all gone, right?
Yeah.
So there's still those juveniles there. There's still some. Right. There's still anything that was a moth caterpillar that was eating chestnut leaves.
I knew moths would come into this.
It might be in a very small population, but there are still chestnut leaves out there for them to eat. So you can imagine that all of those associated things in that community that was around that ecosystem, a large proportion of those might still be there.
I think this.
If the chestnut previously was the dominant species, if it didn't have this blight, then it might just revert back to being the dominant species, because presumably it's the same species that were there that it might come into dominating with. Just thinking.
You can be optimistic about these things, and I think it's probably a much more publicly acceptable way to dip your toes into a synthetic biology solution to a conservation problem. You go, hey, this is a blight-resistant tree.
Yeah, and I think
it's not a genetically modified mouse or a strange mosquito that's
I kind of feel like with plant, like in some ways, and it depends with plants because I think people do get really suspicious because the whole Monsanto and big business and engineering and that going with, big crops like wheat and rice and things. But then I sort of think, people are used to the concept of disease-resistant cauliflower or apples or like with fruit.
Yeah.
It kind of seems, or flowers, I guess cauliflower's a flower. But, it sort of does seem that there's some species that just in your brain, it's much easier to think about them being genetically modified because you're thinking in more of, there's been instances of them being bred as, selective breeding to be disease
I think you raise
resistant.
an interesting point. I often refer to something, the Monsanto effect.
Yeah.
And the fact that a lot of this genetic technology has been linked with big business And people are suspicious for all sorts of reasons.
And,
And part of that suspicion is that means that they capture nobody else can grow that crop anymore.
There's all sort of commercial interests in things.
Yeah.
But if we can say, well, actually, this is for conservation.
Yeah.
And this isn't to make money for anyone. This is to get trees back again.
Yeah.
This is to save incredible Hawaiian endemics.
Yeah.
This is to, restore our island ecosystems. I think you've got a better chance, a better chance in the public.
Well, I think it helps with understanding the concept.
And
because it is an engineering solution, so people do
but
struggle
also
with it.
when you've got the ability to do better trials, like you were saying with a small island, that kind of is one way that's we've got an island here where there's not a lot of things on, but there are mice on. You can start on a very small island and you can show that it works, show that it hadn't gone crazy, then move your way up. And so you're not suddenly introducing genetically modified rice that's taking over all of Asia and it's wind pollinated, so no one's got any choice. And I guess that kind of leads back to the kind of legal and ethical.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, for sure, as these things roll out, there are going to be those very careful checks and balances, and things will be done in a very staged way.
And who does those checks and balances?
Well, there will be government oversight through our kind of HASNO regulations.
That's on an individual country, but I guess some of these things they
you
have
mean internationally.
Yeah, because some of these things, if you introduce a disease-resistant transgenic chestnut into the US, it's in Canada. Like they don't respect political borders.
Yeah,
because once they're out there, they're out there, right?
You've got to negotiate those kind of barriers. There are international guidelines around these things, various protocols.
And is there an international body that just says no, that's too risky? You haven't done the due diligence, or
no one has that.
No one has that power. No one has that authority.
Not for anything. We haven't even pushed back on climate change for those sorts of reasons.
It would be great, though, wouldn't it? If there was just like a...
I think that there tends to be
like a sort of Senate type thing.
Agreement amongst the practitioners. Like very, very quickly when the genetic engineering came out, people said, okay, but not humans. We're not going to be creating humans. We can be modifying and think about disease resistance, but we're not, there are certain kind of hard lines or moratoria.
And is that still true?
I was going to say, how do you monitor that when there's some people with an awful lot of money and just can
Well, you don't. And you
and
can't.
There's people
ultimately.
who would do it in secret with money behind. You can't.
For sure. Yeah, and there have been instances where people have sort of tapped into those kind of areas. Yeah.
It's crazy. Hey, I just wanted to take people back to de-extinction,
okay.
which we were going to do first and then get into the other modes of non-synthetic, but now we've gone the other way.
De-extinction's really interesting term.
It is. What do you think it means to you?
It's kind of you bringing something back. I suppose literally it does mean that we're going to unextinct something. But I think kind of like it would be more like a reintroduction or, but yeah, I just think de-extinction.
It's a problematic term, I think. And
I agree. Do you want a primer on de-extinction?
Well, I was thinking that, just going through because because there will be a lot of people out there who think de-extinction, and there's all sorts of questions around it. And I thought if we just take it back to the first stage of just saying what is de-extinction, how it works, and there's various ways of doing it. So I think most people, they start off thinking dolly the sheep. They think we're going to take something that we've got and we're going to clone it. So we've got a
sheep aren't extinct.
Well, that's true. But that sort of way, we're going to
technology.
We're going to take a thylacine. We're going to take a mammoth. We're going to take the genes of that. We've got the genes. We can make a mammoth genome. Yeah. Why can't we just make a mammoth?
Okay.
So that's the first.
Should we?
Well, that's another.
I mean,
there's a could we, should we?
There's a could we and should we. So the first question, I guess, is can we?
Can we bring back something?
Can we make a mammoth?
Extinct?
Can we make a mammoth? No.
Oh.
And there you go. See, and then the next question is, okay, so
that was a very clear answer, wasn't it?
So we've got the genome there. Why can't we make a mammoth?
Think about it. So this is something that went extinct tens of thousands of years ago. So you could reconstruct what that genome looked like. What are you then going to do with it?
Yeah, that's the question. What are you going to do with it?
The reason you can clone a sheep is because we have sheep.
Oh, okay.
cloning requires living cells.
Right,
so we have
yeah.
living cells. You can,
so
you
in
can
mammals, you have to have something to carry the sheep.
Yeah.
well, you have to have a kind of a living egg that you can put whatever your recreated genome into, and then you have to implant that into a mammoth, and you kind of go, oh,
You
couldn't use an
we
elephant.
forgot the mammoth.
So then if you use an Asian elephant,
That's the idea, but not quite.
yeah, because then the question is, do you just end up with a hairy elephant?
Because it's very difficult to synthesize all the requirements or to recreate an entire genome of an animal. It's much better to find a near relative and go, this has actually got most of the genetic sequences already in place. These are where they differ. So if you look at woolly mammoth and Asian elephant, which are more closely related than Asian elephant and African elephant,
Right.
Okay.
and you go, we could introduce mammoth sequences into an Asian elephant genome to make an Asian elephant that is hairier and fatter and has different blood, so it could live in Siberia.
Right.
So you would create a mammophant, an Asian elephant mammoth hybrid.
Yeah.
When you said that, mammoth ant.
Mammophant.
Mammothant. I missed the f, and it just sounded like a really big ant.
Wow, that's and then it lives in Siberia. So that's great.
No. So it's an interesting, that's an interesting.
So that's why I said you can't get a woolly mammoth back.
Yeah.
You're going to get a hybridized Asian elephant that
back.
might look like a mammoth and might not function like a mammoth.
And then the question is, of course, what's the
point of doing that?
Why are we doing it? Do we want it as a zoo animal? Do we want it as a curiosity? Do we want to just do it because we can do it? Because that is the thing that people quite often do is just...
Those are indefensible reasons, I think, for doing this, because there are ethical and animal welfare concerns. The rationale that's been given is that mammoths used to do something interesting in that environment. They created, the way they trampled and grazed, they created mammoth steppe, grassland habitat that has largely disappeared, and it's become mossy, wetter tundra, which doesn't hold carbon as much.
Right. So they were basically ecological engineers. They
Absolutely.
were the way
they
were and the dominance that they had on the landscape, it just being as big mammals trompling around. And I guess numerous animals as well.
Yep.
So they made a big difference to the ecology of that ecosystem.
Absolutely.
And there's one school of thought where people say, okay, well, then in order to have that's a whole ecosystem that's gone, that's a valid ecosystem.
Yeah.
We could bring that ecosystem back just by introducing, or some of it back, by introducing the mammoth.
Yeah.
We have the technology to do it, let's do it.
Yeah.
But something's there now
Is there
already.
another way we could do it?
Like there is, like you say, it used to be something else, but everything used to be something else.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of questions around that, but that's the rationale given to address climate change. Yeah.
Because
I think it's a weak rationale.
Why is it weak?
How many mammoths do you need?
Yeah.
And what kind of area are we talking about?
How do we get them to behave?
Are they really going to bring these kind of systems back, given the degree of change? Yeah. I think the rationale came after the excitement about maybe being able to do it.
Yeah.
If I'm honest about it. But it doesn't just stop at mammoths. So people are talking about dodo in Mauritius, our icon of extinction. Thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger.
See, now the thylacine, I can see that more because it's a more recent extinction, and I can see some more plausible idea about this whole.
You can't get a thylacine back either.
Yeah.
So what's the nearest relative of a thylacine?
Oh, I don't know.
It's a thing called a fat-tailed dunnart. Oh. Make a fist. It's smaller than that.
Wow, that's a lot smaller than a thylacine.
It's a lot smaller than that. It's probably like my thumb to put together.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because thylacines are like tiger size, right? Or dog size.
Well, like dog size. Dog size, yeah.
Yeah, but see, it's recent enough that it's something that we have video of, for instance, or photos of, right?
So it's engaging,
like contemporary. And it's more likely that the environment is still there.
There are lots of people who still think they're there in the wilds of Tasmania.
I mean,
They're probably not. But
it's like the South Island Kokako, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the South Island Kokako, you could see that would be a good example because it must be quite closely related to the North Island Kokako.
Yes, yeah.
But
then you could argue, well, maybe just North Island Kokako might survive down here. We're not there yet. But one of the things you've got to look at, these are ecological replacements. You could argue that we've lost something, it did something useful in an ecosystem, we want that ecosystem function back again. How do we get it back? Well, you don't immediately go and genetically engineer something. You look around for something that does the same kind of thing in the same kind of way. And people are using this with giant tortoises in places like Seychelles or Galapagos.
But then you're introducing into a fragile, broken system introduced species, aren't you?
An ecosystem engineer to engineer that system back again. In the case of giant tortoises, again, trampling and grazing, they created something called tortoise turf.
Right.
And it was really good for the native plants and it discouraged weeds.
Right.
When you've lost the endemic species off an island, then weeds start to encroach.
Right.
So people have brought other species of giant tortoise, plonked them down there. Giant tortoises do what giant tortoises do, and they've restored that ecosystem.
Right. But then all the complex interactions between the tortoises and, the things that live on other parts of the tortoise that might be species specific. We don't have as a people a full understanding of how any species actually operates in its natural environment. So it seems kind of...
Well, the alternative is you kind of go, wow, we don't know enough, so we'll just wait till we know everything, which we never will.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, you're sort of saying, well, get an ecological equivalent of something, and of course they're not going to be as... There's going to be degrees of difference between
of course.
Those ecological equivalents, as it were.
So to me, that's what de-extinction is for. It's to create an ecological replacement, not to bring back an extinct species. Right. So you've got to have that rationale. You've got to go, we're doing this because it did something useful. So
what are the chances of a moth being de-extincted?
I don't know. Do you have a candidate?
Well, I'm just thinking, there's
something useful.
Like the one.
Does it have to be useful? Why does things have to be useful in a person sense?
Okay, but then you're saying, well, it's just nice to have around. We might as well put it in a zoo. We'll have it in a lab. We'll let people pay to come and see it.
Or I don't know. I think moths were there.
How did we get back to moths again?
I don't know. I just sometimes I think we just focus only on these big charismatic things.
No, you're talking to the converted here.
And I think
there's no surprise that you look at the hit list of de-extinction candidates. They're the same big charismatic megavertebrates we see all the time.
Yeah, and there's a few birds flown in there because
really, these are the most urgent things to try and bring back proxies of.
Yeah.
They're not what necessarily driving these systems, but they're
we
high profile,
see.
they're charismatic. People want to pay money for them.
I feel like they're things that they're bright feathers or fluffy or large, or people see
or
them.
Iconic in some way. I mean, a dodo's a pretty dull-looking bird. It's nearest relative.
Yeah, but it's got a weird name. Who on earth would bring a dodo back?
But it's an icon of extinction. If you could do that, you can do anything. Its nearest relative, and it's not very near, it's like 40 million years distance, is this gorgeous bird called a Nicobar pigeon.
Oh.
I think you should leave the Nicobar pigeons alone. I think they look great.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I always think of is the passenger pigeon.
Oh yeah.
And I think there's a little bit, just massive numbers of them, and they obviously had a huge thing, and they weren't big and bright, and people shot them.
Yeah.
And I do think that in some ways, I think things that are more palatable in a social context are the things that people drove extinct.
Right.
So the dodo, for instance, or the passenger pigeon, and the huia. The huia went extinct largely because Victorians liked the feathers. And they thought, let's trade for the feathers. And then...
So what criteria would you apply, either of you or both of you, to determine what you should bring back?
I would ask several questions first. I'd say, what are you doing this for? Is it an ecological replacement? You go, yep, there's a gap that needs to be filled. Now look around for something that exists that could fill that gap. Because we know the ecology of these things. We can breed them. We can anticipate what they're going to do rather than immediately jumping into back and long distant lost species and try and bring back some proxy that we don't know. It's not going to be the exact thing. We don't know how it's going to operate. We don't know what the life of the first mammophant is going to be like. It's not going to be raised by mammoths. So behaviourally it'll be different. Epigenetically it's different. Physiologically it's different.
I
But if you were given a list
I think
never-ending amounts of funding, how would you determine which one on the list?
I would say
same
okay,
criteria.
These are critical gaps.
Right, yeah.
If we could fill that with something that does X, Y, and Z, we anticipate it would have these wider term effects.
I think I would aim for things that
We're moths.
Yeah.
well, no, not necessarily were moths, but we're like, I think what you're looking for is something that I think the time since it went extinct is very important.
Yeah.
Because the chances of the habitat and the environment that it needs and the things that it coexisted with still being there.
Yeah.
I think that's important, and that's part of the difference between how its behaviour happens and its ecology happens. So I think anything. I think the thylacines marginal. The mammoth is. I don't think we should do it because, yes, that environment was important. Maybe it saves more carbon, but there's other ways to save more carbon.
Yeah.
And I just think it's so big. In order for it to do what you want it to do, it would have to be in so many mammoths back that it would have a huge impact on an ecosystem that we just don't know how that's going to happen. And we don't know that you can just wind things back by having that one thing there. That's not how ecology works. Like, okay, there's tripping points and thresholds, and that's a whole nother discussion. But I think some things, I would go, I don't know that necessarily the idea that it's of importance to people should be the overriding effect, because I think some things have a right to exist by themselves, and I think things like the black robin, for instance, that would naturally have gone extinct at that point where we intervened, in the sense of people, and that was through them being raised. I don't know if that counts as synthetic biology, does it? They were still breeding the pairs there, but they were being raised by another species.
Fostered out. Yeah.
And I think at that point you're sort of crossing that line where you take an egg from a similar species, you put DNA into it, and then you're getting it raised by a foster species. And that might be preferable in terms of getting a bird with a gape size that can disperse fruit that are bigger than getting an ecological equivalent from Australia, which is not actually going to be that close an ecological equivalent because it has different parasites, it has different interactions with everything. So,
my position is really, I think the technology advancing is great. I'm a technological enthusiast. I'm not an enthusiast for de-extinction. I think you're right. It's a terrible term because it's misleading. But push that technology and then use it to avert extinctions rather than bring things back when it's too late.
And there's the cost implication as well. And there's the social implication. Like, if people suddenly think that you can just snap your fingers and de-extinct things, do people work as hard to stop things going extinct?
Think about, what's the basis of conservation messaging? Extinction is forever. What if you went, well, maybe it's not? You go, oh, okay, we'll bring it back later.
Yeah, and
it'll be right. We'll just... Yeah.
And, I mean, is it actually ever going to work, really? Because are you just going to get this mixture? I mean, you can think of backbreeding things, which was the other way, not cloning. So, you've got the ancestral cow. We want that back because they did something. That's just getting a look-alike, really. I think it's a bit of a cheat.
No, I think it's the idea of... You think of a lot of our species have been through genetic bottlenecks. You could use synthetic biology techniques to re-engineer lost genetic diversity into things like kakapo.
Oh, yeah. Because you've got lots of examples of kakapo in museums and things.
You go in there and you go, actually, this is what the range of genetic diversity. Let's synthesize some of these things.
Isn't it?
Yeah. So
at that point, it's really interesting because you've still got the actual bird. It's not extinct.
Absolutely, yeah. So if enthusiasm by some people for woolly mammoth hybrids is the way to push the technology, fine, do it. I think the media doesn't do good service. I don't think the people pushing woolly mammoth stuff are completely honest. because they still talk about woolly mammoths. We're going to get woolly mammoth back in 5 years or 6
and
years.
And that's just not going to happen.
It's just not going to happen. And, you've got to check the label on that one.
Yeah. And there's all sorts of things, just the behaviour around that, as you're saying, how things are raised and the environment they're dropped into as well. There's all those things that make, before you even get into epigenetics.
Well, they just get those big road rollers and drive them all around Siberia. Like, they must do the same footprint.
I don't think that's going to work.
Mammoths, but I put my hand up for that job.
Yeah, there you go. Road rolling around Siberia. Yeah, what could go wrong?
But I guess the other thing is, apart from just the people stop thinking about extinction as a thing that's forever, there's also the opportunity cost. There's a lot of money, like just the thought process of that project to de-extinct, in quotation marks, the mammoth and put those mammothants out there.
Semi-commercial.
That's a lot of money, though, and that's money that's not being spent on other conservation projects.
There are arguments for and against that. So the people pushing mammoth is a group called Colossal Biosciences in the US.
Right.
And they've raised over $200 million to do mammoth, thylacine and dodo. And to be fair to them, they're also involved in conservation work in relation to those species. And they've done that by tapping people who wouldn't necessarily normally be paying for conservation. So you could argue this is new money.
Right.
That's one
side. So it's not taking money from
it's not like,
conservation. Someone's not going to donate that to the yellow-eyed penguin.
Should I pay for a park ranger or should I, no, people going, woolly mammoth, that sounds great. I'll put money into that.
Right.
But there are costs downstream. So those that push the technology, once you've got a mammoth, you've got to release it.
Yeah.
And go and do things, monitor it and look after it. And people are less enthusiastic about kind of post-release.
Yeah, people are always less enthusiastic
Imagine we
about
did something in
monitoring.
New Zealand. We brought back a
Haast
hybrid
eagle.
I would bring back the Haast eagle. That's what I would bring back first.
You'd make all alpine tramping adventure tourism, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Honestly, it'd be so. But that's exactly.
I don't think the little bamboo stick up the back of your pack would work.
I know, and it's like people get mad at Kia, right? For destroying their cars. Imagine a Haast eagle. Who's going to pay the cost of that? Like, are the people who
you'd have to get Haast eagle insurance?
Like, where does who pays for that? That's the real.
I was thinking of a simpler thing. Maybe
some
nice bird that's not going to eat people or scare away tourists.
That's so fun.
But if you've taken this, we've produced it in the lab. Here it is, a whole lot, and you give it to the Department of Conservation. You go, now you look after it, and they go, okay, hang on, we're just making some budget cuts over here, and we'll find out.
Because it's not like things aren't tough already, and there's a whole bunch of species who haven't crossed that threshold of being extinct, but are really needing help. And
we can't take our eye off the fact that we're not winning that biodiversity loss.
Yeah.
It's the first rule of intelligent tinkering is keep all the pieces. Keep everything alive. Because it's a lot harder to try and bring things back in some other form.
Yeah.
So what's the attraction then of bringing things back? Like it's attracting this new money.
I'd pay to see a mammoth. Wouldn't you pay to see a mammoth?
Yeah.
Or even
even
if it was a fat, hairy elephant, I'd go and give it a look at that.
I'd pay to see the Haast eagle.
Or some version of it.
Some version of it.
Yeah. Wasn't there one hanging up in Wellington Airport?
I was going to say, the one in Wellington Airport, I think, oh man, every time I go past that, I think,
Really? So that's all. So they want to pay for the attraction to go look at something.
I don't know.
No, I think it's that sense of wonder and inspiration and whatever. And
it's
wow,
why Doctor Who is such a
woolly mammoth.
A
of course, they're
show.
extinct, and then someone's saying, "Well, we could bring them back," and you kind of go, "Wow, could you?" And they go, "Yeah."
Yeah, well, wait, but then when you say to the same people, but we should say what we've got now, they don't find that quite as attractive.
Because that's harder.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's not new and novel, it's harder. It's just doing the same, predator, look after the environment, do something that you don't, like, it's not exciting. I honestly, I feel like there's an excitement factor. I think there's a guilt factor as well.
There's a huge excitement factor. If we come back to whole synthetic biology, I think there should be a huge excitement factor, but there's a lot of pushback.
Yeah. Well, I can feel that as well. Even with the mice example, I sort of feel like, I'm a bit nervous about that because you're introducing a gene and it's not something that was there before, and if it's got the potential to be able to eradicate a whole species from an island,
but your response,
that's powerful.
Your response to that isn't to say, don't even do it, don't even think about it. I'm sure your response is more to go, we need to know more about this.
Yeah,
could
and
this
to
work
try
or
it and to do experiments, to be careful. And that's my rational, ecological mind.
There are groups in the conservation community internationally whose response is, this should just go away. We don't want anything to do with it. Yeah. Anyone who's engaging with this is on the wrong side. We need to be going back to the basics.
I don't think that polemic point where people are just divided and there's no discussion, I don't think that ever serves. I don't think it serves society, and I don't think it serves academia or
what's
science.
The best case for these people is that this will go away. It's not. Synthetic biology for conservation is nothing compared to agriculture. It's booming everywhere. You wouldn't believe how many products around you are the result of synthetic biology processes. And in medicine. These things are going to be pushed
targeted gene
and
therapy
developed.
is amazing, right? Yeah. And that just changes, not just people but families' lives. We had Perry Guilford on here talking about it's kind of different, but it's like the developing the test for the stomach cancer that whole thing. And
the whole area of technology, I think you've got to embrace it. Explore it, see where it goes, think about the appropriate applications, think about the risk management, but not be so tied up about, what if something goes wrong? You can be paralysed by worrying about unintended consequences. Because I think there are frameworks for thinking about risk in sensible ways that means that you can get the best out of these things.
I guess the other side of that coin is that if we do nothing, things are going terribly wrong as it is.
Yeah.
And by just leaving potentially a very big tool in the toolbox, we're actually already making a decision. And I think sometimes with humans, it's part of our DNA. That, not like proactively doing something as opposed to bad consequences from not doing something. There's a discontinuity between those two things.
You want to have that discussion about how to regulate it, how to manage it. Yeah. If you disengage from that, then it will be done by someone without regulation, without discussion.
Exactly.
I mean, that's back to the whole invasive species thing, and
mad scientists, lots of money,
and RCD and stuff. If you don't have some discussion and regulate it, then you're going to get it anyway in uncontrolled ways, and it's going to be bad all over the place.
Exciting times.
Yeah. We just got a couple of seconds left here. Phil, last points there. I think
we're on the verge of a step change in the way we can do these things, and I think we need to embrace the potential of these kind of new technologies and see where they could lead us.
And I think discussion is the way forward. Thank you very much for coming along today, Phil. There's a lot of interesting ideas there. We're going to get a couple more people to come along and talk about this topic from different lenses later on in the series, and then we might try and put together a panel discussion that's live out there with an audience.
Sounds good.
Sounds awesome. Thank you very much. Hey, you've been listening to the OI podcast. If you enjoyed this episode with Phil Seddon, we think you'll like the episodes Ancient DNA with an extinct duck with Associate Prof Nick Rawlins, and Where Does the New Zealand Bird Fauna Come From with Dr Michael Knapp or Michelle Knapp. And look out for these new episodes on synthetic biology conservation. Ka kite.
Cool.
You've been listening to the OI podcast, the shout out for the arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI podcast on OAR FM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.